Folks, if you're joining us for the first time, this is the Apologetics Academy, the website apologetics-academy.org. I'm Jonathan McClatchy, and I run this weekly apologetics webinar. We bring on different scholars, theologians, scientists, philosophers, thinkers from across the theological and philosophical spectrum to present on topics of interest to Christians, particularly those which pertain to whether or not the gospel is true. And we also cross-examine and evaluate other worldviews such as Islam and Mormonism as well. There's a number of ways you can participate in tonight's interactive program. You can, if you have a question to ask of our guest speaker, you can type it into the Q&A box, which you can find at the top of your screen, top left. It says Q&A. Click that, type in your question. You can submit it anonymously if you wish. You can also click the raise hand button at the appropriate time at the end of the presentation. I'll promote you to be a co-panelist with our guest speaker, and you have opportunity to ask questions that way also. And you can also, of course, participate in the chat window. Please direct questions to everyone rather than just panelists. That would be great. Just to give you an idea of what's coming up in the next few weeks. Next Saturday, November 25th, we have with us Anthony Rogers, who writes at Answering Islam. He's going to talk to us about, is the Old Testament Trinitarian, which is actually was a subject of a recent debate of mine with Yusuf Ismail. So we look forward to hearing what Anthony has to say on this topic. Then the following week, December 2nd, we have with us Dr. Corey Miller and Dr. Lynn Wilder, who's going to be talking to us about leaving Mormonism, why scholars changed their minds, which is going to be based on a book to which they contributed on that subject. Then the following Saturday, December 9th, we have with us Paul Garner, who's a geologist, and Dr. Stephen Lloyd, who's a theologian, and they're going to be giving us a young Earth perspective. We've had Dr. Jack Collins on in the past giving us an old Earth perspective on creation. But this on December 9th, we're going to have those individuals giving us a young Earth perspective. Their talk is entitled, How Old is the Earth and Does It Matter? Theological and Scientific Perspectives. So it'll be interesting to hear the contrast of their respective viewpoints in contrast to Professor Collins, who was on with us previously. So coming back to today, then, we have with us Dr. Justin Bass, and we're honored to have such a distinguished thinker, and he is currently at Georgia Evangelical Theological Seminary, and he is going to be talking to us about the subject of the dead. This topic is the treasures at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Bible, and Jesus. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Dr. Justin Bass. If you want to maybe just introduce yourself, Justin, for the sake of those that maybe haven't come across you before, and then just launch into the topic, that would be excellent.
Jonathan, thanks so much for having me back. I think it was it 2 years ago we did the Son of Man?
Something like lecture. That, yeah.
It was 2 years ago, so good to be back, and thanks so thankful for all that you do for the apologetics world and for the kingdom. And I'm Justin Bass. I'm passionate as well about apologetics, into lecturing on anything really with early Christianity, historical Jesus, New Testament, debated on certain topics with Bart Ehrman and Dan Barker and some other atheists and unbelievers, and have my PhD in New Testament studies from Dallas Theological Seminary, and I was the pastor of a church for many years, and now our family have moved to Amman, Jordan, and I'm a professor here, and we're also helping with an NGO, helping with the refugee crisis here, with the Syrian and Iraqi refugees, doing what we can. And so just good to be here, good to be on. Ahlan bil Ordin, I had to give you a little bit of Arabic. So I'm shway. My wife and I are learning Arabic. We have a tutor, a great tutor we're meeting with regularly, but I know about 20 words still right now. So those are a few of those 20. But welcome to this talk on the Dead Sea Scrolls, a topic I'm passionate about, excited to share. As Jonathan said, treasures at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Bible, and Jesus. As I just said, 3 months ago, actually, my family moved from Frisco, Texas, to Amman, Jordan. Not a usual move, but we are so blessed to be here in Jordan, and we'll see what the Lord has for us, how long we're here, but we're looking at years for sure. And In fact, this past week, my wife and I were celebrating our 14-year wedding anniversary. Praise the Lord for that. And we were at the Dead Sea. So we were at the Dead Sea on the Jordan side, obviously, but we could see not the caves where the scrolls were found, but we could see the area where Qumran is, where the area where these priceless treasures of the Hebrew scriptures and many other things were discovered 70 years ago this year. Can you believe that? 2017. And these were discovered in 1947, 70 years ago this year. And I wanted to do this talk actually from the Dead Sea. I actually thought about doing something where we could do it from the Dead Sea, but it's actually 10 p.m. here, very dark. It would have been meaningless because you wouldn't have been able to see anything. So I thought, just the fact that I'm in Jordan and near the Dead Sea, and the fact that some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here in the Jordan Museum, I thought that was pretty much good enough for a good setting for this subject. And I'll get back to the Dead Sea Scrolls that are in the Jordan Museum. Talk about that in a little bit. I want to begin with a short movie clip. Those who know me know I have to have a movie clip all the time, but this will be very, very short, talking seconds. But when we're talking about such an extraordinary discovery of biblical proportions, literally, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think we should all have one man's name in mind, and that is Indiana Jones. I think we need to be thinking about Indiana Jones, and I want Indiana Jones to be kind of out there and in front of you throughout this talk, because this is an Indiana Jones level discovery. And I hope most of you know, Indiana Jones is not real, and the things he's discovered in those movies are not real, that they're fiction. But what I'm about to share with you, this Indiana Jones level discovery, is real life. This really happened 70 years ago. And so without further ado, let me give you a quick clip. Enjoy. Okay, that's all I wanted to show from that. But still a great scene. Still awesome to see the Ark of the Covenant, even though that really wasn't the Ark of the Covenant. And this is not an Ark of the Covenant level discovery, I have to say. I'd say the Ark of the Covenant, if that was discovered, my goodness, because we wouldn't just be getting the Ark of the Covenant, we would, of course, be getting the stones that God directly wrote with his finger. The Ten Commandments, those are inside the Ark of the Covenant. We would be getting the Aaron's staff that budded. We would be getting the jar of manna. We'd be getting that what is it. We'd be able to taste the what is it. Just that would be, of course, the ultimate, I think, biblical discovery. But this is second. This is second best, and this is real. So it's even better because it's actually real. This actually happened in real life. This is not just a movie, but the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls could be a movie, I got to say. Let me also begin with some book recommendations, okay? There's some certain books, and as the reformers said, to the sources. We need to go to the primary sources, so there's so much written on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but what I want to do is recommend to you really the key books to where you can read all the Dead Sea Scrolls. I would hope that everyone who tunes in and listens to this would read the Dead Sea Scrolls for yourself. Really an incredible group of knowledge and wisdom found within these scrolls. So first and foremost, I'm going to do this right in the picture this time. So this is one of the definitive versions, the Penguin Classic of Gaze of Ramesh, the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. This is one of the standard texts by one of the great scholars who worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Gaze of Ramesh, a Jewish scholar. He's passed now. And notice it says the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. You can't see it, but trust me, it says the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. But this is a bit of fake news here from Penguin Classic. I've had to deal with this for other books from Penguin. This is not the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. It has none of the biblical Dead Sea Scrolls. It has all the non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls. For Gaze of Ramesh, to give him credit, he says in the beginning, in the introduction, that this is not the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. But you could be deceived a little bit since it says it's the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. To get the complete Dead Sea Scrolls, you need to read all of this, which is all the non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls. And then you need to read what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. It's like this. And it says it is the oldest known Bible translated for the first time in English. Now, what this is all the biblical scrolls discovered at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls that are biblical, translated into English. So if you read Gaze of Ramesh and you read this, you would read pretty much, other than maybe some fragments here and there, you would read all the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then there's another volume for those out there who may be able to read Hebrew. This is it's called the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition. Yeah, that's what I want. Okay, you can see it a little bit. And it's Garcia Martinez. And this also is not all the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it is all the non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls, like Gaze of Ramesh, but it probably has more because there's a lot of repetition, a lot of the same documents twice, and Garcia Martinez has them all. But plus, as you see, it has a diglot, so you can have the Hebrew. So here's a section of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I have the Hebrew right here on the left, so you can compare the Hebrew with the English in this volume. So this is the ideal one if you know Hebrew, but you still got to get the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible to be able to read the translation of the biblical scrolls. And by the way, he also does all the variants. He lets you know all the variants, all the differences between the Dead Sea Scroll version of, say, Isaiah, and the comparing it to the Septuagint version, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew, and to the Masoretic text, which we'll talk about, which is the Hebrew manuscripts that all of our English translations are based on, and that were the oldest Hebrew manuscripts we had before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But so those are the three you really need to read, and read those for yourself. Highly encourage you to do that. Let me get back to tell you briefly about the Dead Sea Scrolls housed in the Jordan Museum, Amman, Jordan. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually housed at the Jerusalem Museum, but there are some very significant ones that are at the Amman, Jordan Museum. And I actually just discovered this a month ago, literally. I actually had been reading some works on the Dead Sea Scrolls because of a lecture I was going to do for the class that I'm teaching at JETS right now at Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. It's a class on bibliology, so I was talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible. And as I was reading, I came across one of the only representatives of Ecclesiastes that was discovered at Qumran. There were only 2 fragments of Ecclesiastes discovered, and one of them is dated to 175 BC. 175 BC. And it's the oldest manuscript we have of Ecclesiastes in Hebrew. It covers a few chapters, portions of a few chapters. And I read that it was housed at the Amman, Jordan Museum. And I got to tell you, I was the nerd that I am, I was pretty excited. I was sitting in Starbucks, the glorious Starbucks here in Amman, Jordan. Let me tell you, it's an amazing Starbucks here in Amman, Jordan. You got to come just see the Starbucks and then see the Dead Sea Scrolls. at the Jordan Museum. But I was sitting there and I realized that I was 20 minutes away from the Jordan Museum. And I mean, how often when you read something, you read about some 2,000-year-old treasure, you discover that you are 20 minutes away from it, that you could drive to it. That's an incredible thing. This is one of the blessings of living in the Middle East. So this could never happen in Frisco. In Frisco, if I found something, the oldest it is probably in the days of Blockbuster or something like that. But if you find something here, it could go back to the time of Jesus or even 100 years before, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I didn't go that very day to the Jordan Museum to see these priceless treasures, but I took my bibliology class on a field trip. I had the books written up here for you. That's okay. I think I'll send out this PowerPoint if anybody needs it. But here we are. This is the class of bibliology, and we were blessed to have actually the president of Jordan Evangelical Seminary, Dr. Ahmad. He's there with us, and sorry for the darkness, but they wouldn't allow us to do light flash, camera flash, and so. But behind, if you see me in the middle, right behind me is displayed all the fragments and the pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the book of the portions of Ecclesiastes that date to 175 BC. And there are 4 other scrolls as well. Here is the one from Ecclesiastes. As I said, the oldest, you were looking at the oldest, most ancient Hebrew manuscript of Ecclesiastes that exists. And this is at the Jordan Museum. I'm not going to show you them all because I want you to come to Amman, Jordan, so you can see them. But this is a really neat one too. This is actually a manuscript that scholars give the title Messianic Testimonia. It's a list of verses from the Old Testament that the Essene community at Qumran put together that they believe pointed to this future Messiah. So there's passages here that they believe were Messianic, and what's really fascinating about it is many of those passages are also passages that we find in the New Testament applied to Jesus, like Deuteronomy 18, Numbers 24, the star will arise out of Jacob, passages like that. They're right there in Hebrew. Can't you read them? You need to look at it a little bit closer, even if you knew Hebrew. But it was neat. I had been teaching these students things about the Bible, but I was actually able to show them the Bible. I was able to show them the Bible. There's the Bible right there. There's Ecclesiastes. We don't have the autograph, but man, that's pretty close to it. So that was a neat thing that happened just recently. Let me talk about the discovery. Let me tell a little bit about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like I said, it's an action movie in itself. Hopefully someone will do a movie on it someday. But in the spring of 1947, so 70 years ago, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad had something happen to him that happens, I'm sure, to shepherds thousands of times since the beginning of time, since the beginning of shepherds. And that is, his goat got away from him. So his goat wandered away, not his sheep, his goat. And being a good shepherd, Muhammad went after that one lost goat, which had jumped up onto the rocks and had wandered into a cave. Muhammad, smart shepherd that he was, knew that he didn't need to go and try to climb and get that goat. He just needed to throw some rocks and scare him and get the goat back. But when he threw rocks this time, he heard a crash. He heard some unfamiliar noises, and that was the rocks hitting the clay pottery, the clay pots that housed the first 7 scrolls that were discovered in this cave. And so Muhammad did climb, and he went in there, and he found pots that look like this. I don't think these are the exact pots from this cave, but these are clay pots that were found in at least 1 or 2 of the caves by the Dead Sea. And in one of these clay pots were 7 scrolls in this, what came to be known as Cave 1, in the spring of 1947. And let me just show you what are the 7 scrolls, real briefly, in this Cave 1. And this is really important because these are some of the most important, these just happen to be 7 of the most important scrolls that were found. One, the greatest, I think, of all the finds, and most would agree with this, is the fully complete Isaiah scroll. So Isaiah, one of the largest books of the Old Testament, 66 chapters. Chapters came in later. It wasn't chapters, but the 66 chapters of Isaiah in Hebrew. We have the complete scroll discovered in this first cave, in this clay pot that housed these scrolls. A partial version of Isaiah was also discovered. Genesis Apocryphon, which is basically just a retelling of some early chapters of Genesis. Pesher Habakkuk, which is just basically a commentary, Jewish commentary on Habakkuk, which happens to be among many commentaries that were discovered, but the longest one. It's the most in-depth one. The Community Rule, which was basically the key text that tells us a ton about this community, the Essenes. Their purification rites, how they lived, how they followed the Mosaic laws, all kinds of things about the community. Thanksgiving hymns, basically their praises to God, and the War Scroll, which shows us how apocalyptic this group was. This group believed that they were the sons of light about to do battle with the sons of darkness, and God was about to usher in his kingdom, probably within their lifetime. I'm sure they believed the end of the world was imminent. So these 7 scrolls lay some 1,900 years. This group and these caves were left undisturbed since AD 70, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. From AD 70 to 1947, sat in this cave undisturbed until they were found by a goat. The real hero of the story, by the way. I mean, you need to realize the hero of the Dead Sea Scrolls story is this goat. He could have gone right. He could have gone a different way. He could have stayed with the pack. He could have not wandered away. He could have not gone in this cave. But because he did, we found this, one of the greatest discoveries of all time. And if we had just found these 7 scrolls, this would have been the greatest biblical discovery of all time. But we found much, much more. So the young Muhammad took his scrolls, probably took the clay pot with the scrolls in them, I'm sure, and took them back to his Bedouin tribe. And they in turn sold the 7 scrolls to a man named Kando. And Kando was a shoemaker and a part-time antiquities dealer. He was doing that on the side. And he was living in Bethlehem at the time. And then Kando, in turn, separated the scrolls out, 3 and 4, and sold them to 2 different people. And there's so much great stuff in this story, but let me just tell you about one of them. He sold 3 of the scrolls to a Hebrew professor at the time of Hebrew University in Jerusalem named Dr. Eleazar Sukenik. He sold 3 of them to Sukenik, but Sukenik was in Jerusalem at the time. Kando was in Bethlehem, and in 1947, to travel from Jerusalem to Bethlehem was a dangerous trek. And Sukenik had to disguise himself. And so he disguised himself and then got to Kando in Bethlehem, got back to Jerusalem. And let me just tell you this incredible historical fact with this. So he got these 3 scrolls. Now the first person that could actually read the scrolls, the goat couldn't read the scrolls, I'm sure you're aware. The young Bedouin Muhammad couldn't read the scrolls. And Kando could not read the scrolls. None of them knew how to read Hebrew. Dr. Sukenik could read the scrolls. And he had, one of those 3 scrolls was the scroll of Isaiah. And he started reading them, and he takes note in his diary. We have his diary, and he tells us that he started reading these scrolls on November 29th, 1947. This is a significant historical fact because on November 29th, 1947, that's the same exact day, and he makes note of this in the diary, that the UN was deciding to make Israel an independent nation. Quite an incredible coincidence on November 29th, 1947. So over the next 8 years, 1948 to 1956, 11 caves, 10 more caves beyond Cave 1, will be discovered, and 930 scrolls, 2,000-year-old scrolls, I might add, would become available to the world, along with pots and coins and other ancient artifacts. Even date palm seeds. I got to tell you a little bit about the date palm seeds. So there were some date palm seeds found at Masada, one of the caves that's included in this. And these date palm seeds date back to 150 BC. And some of the scholars actually planted one of these seeds, and it has now grown to over 6 feet high. It is a palm date tree that's grown over 6 feet high, and they believe it's going to produce dates by 2022. It's the oldest known tree. It's the oldest known tree seed successfully germinated, and the only living representative of a Judean date palm tree, which actually went extinct about 1,000 years ago. Pretty amazing stuff. It's like Jurassic Park. It's a true Jurassic Park. It's not a dinosaur, but we basically brought back to life a tree that had been dead for 1,000 years. Pretty incredible thing. And somebody's going to eat those dates and maybe live forever. Doubtful, but. So let's talk about these scrolls. What were these 930 scrolls found in these 11 caves near the Dead Sea? How old are they? Who do they belong to? You know, not always do you have clear answers. In fact, most of the time you don't have straight, clear answers about things in history. But what is very cool about the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that I can answer those questions with almost universal scholarly consent. So scholars who study these things, who spent the last 70 years studying these things, are almost universally agreed upon when it comes to the answers to those questions. So again, what is the content of the 930 scrolls, and who did they belong to? Well, they belong to this Jewish sect known as the Essenes. So this is basically their library. This is their surviving library. Okay, this is what has the 930 scrolls, and really, to be fair, it's like 25,000 of them are fragments that scholars had to put together like jigsaw puzzle pieces. Incredible work that's been done that we stand just bear the fruit of it when we read the English translations, like I pointed out. But basically, of these 930 scrolls, and many of them fragments, this is what has survived the sands of time over the last 1900 years from the Essene library in these caves. And we'll talk more about the Essenes in a little bit, but let's look at these scrolls. Let's unroll the scrolls, because remember, these aren't books. There were no books, no codex or anything like books found in these caves. They were all scrolls that you unroll. You could unroll them. So the most important of the 930 scrolls, I think most would agree, are the biblical scrolls, which are 230 of the 930. 230 of them are biblical scrolls, meaning these are books from what we call the Old Testament, or Jews call the Hebrew Bible. These are 230 of the scrolls are the biblical books. And 23 of the 24, to say that in more this is the ancient, I'm giving you the ancient Jewish numbering. So the way Jews, still to this day, but back then in the ancient world, numbered the Old Testament, it was 24 books. Some would even say 22 books. But that 22 or 24 books is the same as our 39 books, just so you know. So it's the same exact books, they just numbered them differently. So 1st and 2nd Kings is just Kings for them. Ezra, Nehemiah is one book. The 12 minor prophets is counted as one book. So this is how you get 24, and this is why we get 39, because we divide them up. But 23 of the 24, so you can say 38 of the 39 Old Testament books are represented among these 230 biblical scrolls. The only one that's not is Esther. Esther, she gets a bad rap. I feel bad for Esther. This is one of the books that gets rejected a lot in the canonical list. I don't know what it is, but Esther is not found among them. We don't know for sure why. It doesn't mean for sure that the Essenes rejected Esther. They may well have had Esther there, and it just disintegrated with the sands of time, like many of the other manuscripts did. Maybe they only had a few scrolls of Esther, and that's why it disappeared. That's what I think. I think they probably accepted Esther because they had Ruth. It's not because she's a woman or anything like that. They had Ruth. We have manuscripts from Ruth. But it is possible. One of the reasons why some were skeptical of Esther is because it never mentions God. God is never specifically mentioned in the book of Esther by providential design, obviously, if you know the book of Esther. But I choose to think that Esther is not included because it just disintegrated whatever scrolls they did have. But all the books are represented except Esther. And here's the best part. How old are these scrolls? And this part really should blow your mind. If you really know about these things, this should blow your mind, because they go back to 250 BC, and at the earliest, AD 50. But most of the scrolls, biblical scrolls, date in the 100 to 200 BC time frame. This is incredible. More on why that should blow your mind later. I'll get into that more later. Let me say a few more things about these biblical scrolls. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the top 3 used books and represented in scrolls were Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. And these are also the most commented on books, the most quoted books among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is very interesting, because if you go to the New Testament, what are the top 3 books that are quoted, alluded to, represented in the New Testament? The same 3 books: Psalms, Isaiah, Deuteronomy. And by the way, these quotations here and allusions, these are things I did myself. I've actually counted this myself. The quotations in the quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament, and allusions to each of these books. And if you notice, if you round out the top, if you just do the top 5, Exodus and Genesis in the New Testament are round out the top 5. It's the same with the Essenes. Exodus and Genesis are also the other most used and most represented by scrolls books among the Essenes. So an interesting parallel, one of many, between the Essenes and the early Christians. And by the way, if you limit it just to Paul's letters, I've done the numbers on just Paul's letters. Paul's letters, Psalms, Isaiah, and it may be Genesis, but these 5 are the top. Psalms and Isaiah are always the top 2. And Deuteronomy and Exodus and Genesis are the top 5 for Paul as well, even if you just limit it to Paul's letters. These are clearly the books that these ancient Jews honed in on. These are the ones that they really focused on and found the most meat in, it seems. The next is the biblical commentaries. So as with the first cave 1, they found the commentary in Habakkuk, but they found commentaries on just about all the minor prophets, commentaries obviously on Psalms, on Isaiah, on just about all the canonical books. So just about all the 23 of the 24 biblical books, we have representation of either quotations or commentaries. Interestingly, we don't have any commentaries on apocryphal books or pseudepigraphical books, which is a big word that just means false writings. These are books that were written at the time of Jesus or 200 years before by Jews that were false writings. That's why it's pseudo writings, false writings. They're attributed to some ancient Jewish hero like Enoch. First Enoch, for example, is a pseudepigraphical book, or the Testament of Abraham, or things like that. But they're false writings, because Abraham really didn't write that. Enoch really didn't write First Enoch, things like that. Apocryphal books are separated out because these are books that some branches of different faith groups actually consider canonical, so they separate those out from the pseudepigraphical books, which pretty much no one accepts as canonical. So biblical commentaries make up a portion of these 930 scrolls. And then we do have some apocryphal books represented: Tobit, the Epistle of Jeremiah, Sirach, Jesus ben Sirach. So these are 3 books that are represented with some scrolls at Qumran. And then we have some pseudepigraphical books, so Jubilees. Interestingly, Jubilees we only had in translation until the Dead Sea Scroll find, and now we have it in the original Hebrew. It's originally written in Hebrew, and we got the first copy of that in Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls. First Enoch, we also have the original, probably, version of that, which is in Aramaic. And unfortunately, the Enoch that we discovered at Qumran doesn't have these chapters in between it, chapters 37 through 72, which is this very important set of chapters, because this is where Enoch discusses the Son of Man figure that I talked about in the last time I led an Apologetics Academy lecture. So you can go back to that lecture to learn more about that. But unfortunately, that's not there. So we don't have the Son of Man language in the Qumran documents. And some previously unknown psalms. So psalms that we had never heard of, that we had never read or saw quoted or anything, are discovered by the Qumran community. Whether they consider them canonical or these are just more writings that they use to praise God, we don't know for sure. And then lastly, we have the Essene community writings. So this is their actual writings that they wrote, dealing with their community, the way they lived, their daily routine, their religious rites, everything. That's the community rule, the Damascus document, the worship. The war scroll, as I said, is very apocalyptic. They believed they were the sons of light about to do battle with the sons of darkness. Sons of light also, by the way, shows up in the New Testament. Jesus and Paul both refer to followers of Jesus as sons of light. The temple scroll is interesting because the Essene community believed that they were representing the true temple of God, not the Jerusalem temple. Same thing with the Christians. The early Christians, as you know from Paul's letters, we are the temple of God. The Christians, filled by the Holy Spirit, are the temple of God. And then the copper scroll. This is just another fun one, like the palm date tree that I had to tell you about. So the copper scroll is just a treasure map. So there's actually a treasure map in the Qumran caves that gives you directions, very confusing directions, but directions nevertheless to the amount of gold and silver that would make the king of Sparta blush. If you remember the Count of Monte Cristo, remember he discovers the treasure of Sparta. Remember, he becomes just filthy rich. If you found what they claim is in if you found what this treasure claims that you're going to find, this treasure map, you would have more money than the treasure of Sparta in the Count of Monte Cristo. And let me tell you, scholars and people have definitely tried. So if you want to grab a shovel and go to the Dead Sea and start searching for this treasure and see what you can find, go at it. But nobody's found a coin yet. But scholars actually believe that it's legitimate. It's actually probably buried somewhere out there, but the sands of time have covered it. So we'll see. We'll see if a bunch of gold coins and silver shows up sometime in the future. What about the Essene community themselves? Who were they? How do we know about them? Surprisingly, they're never mentioned in the New Testament. In the New Testament, you've never seen anything about the Essenes and Jesus. Jesus might have mentioned them when he said that some, in Matthew 19, he said, some have sacrificed marriage for the kingdom of heaven. That's exactly what the Essenes did, what they were well known for, being celibate. Many of them were celibate, not all of them. But the New Testament does mention the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Samaritans, many of the sects of Judaism at the time, but they don't mention the Essenes, which is interesting. But they might, like I said in that passage and others in Paul's letters, there may be a reference to the way they live. The Essenes are discussed only by Philo of Alexandria, Pliny the Elder, and Josephus. These are, as you see their dates, they are very relevant dates for the time of the Essenes, which would have been about 150 BC to 70 AD. So all the three of these are very good sources. And in fact, Pliny the Elder himself actually says he knew some of the Essenes. He met them by the Dead Sea, actually right near the area where our caves were discovered, and where all these scrolls were found. And these are kind of some key traits about the Essenes that they all agree on, give or take. Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder. They were very strictly observing the Mosaic law, even more than the Pharisees. Paul talks about how he was strict and followed the law to the T and everything. The Essenes were even more strict. And we see that even from the community rule and from their documents. They, for example, if a donkey or any type of animal fell into a ditch or fell into the water, you don't save it on the Sabbath. You just let it die. So this was something that even the Pharisees, nobody did that. The Essenes did that. There's a ton of other examples like that. But very strict observers of the law. Baptism, another interesting parallel between the Essene community and the Christians. They're the only two communities we know of at this time in Judaism that baptized by immersion like this, like what we've come to know, like the way John the Baptist baptized. This is something the Essenes did as well at Qumran. And Jews all had purification rites, and they all used water and different things. But baptism by immersion, this was unique to the Essenes and to the early Christians. The Essenes were focused on celibacy. Not all of them, though. Josephus, in fact, tells us that a large portion of the Essenes did not, were not celibate and were married and had children. And in fact, near Qumran, we found the bodies of women and children in graves. Mostly the bodies we found there are men, but there have been some women and children. So there might have been more of a mix. But celibacy was definitely something they were known for. And then, as I said, Pliny the Elder specifically met this group, probably the same group who owned this library of 930 scrolls, plus all the ones that disappeared through time and disintegration. Pliny the Elder actually talks about them in his writing in Natural History, and he actually interacted with this very group that we have their scrolls. And Josephus makes this comment about them. This is just one comment he says. He says, they also, talking about the Essenes, they take great pains in studying the writings of the ancients. We have that also in Philo. A lot of emphasis on the fact that they would study the law and they were reading their books, they would study. And what's so neat is we have in our possession, as I said, with these 930 scrolls, we have in our possession those writings they so vigorously studied. Truly incredible. And skipping ahead, let me just, I had a lot prepared to tell you the history of the Essenes, but my lecture ended up taking a lot longer than I had planned. So I cut all that out, but you can read about them, a lot about them in Gazer Ramesh's volume, his 90-page introduction, which is excellent, on the history of all this and the Essenes. But if you skip ahead to the 60s, the late 60s AD, you have the war between mainly the Jewish zealots, but a lot of the Jews at the time, with the Romans. And this Jewish war, which Josephus, as many of you know, documented and was an eyewitness at, he was present not on the Jewish side, he was on the Roman side. They didn't like that, as you can imagine. He tells one story where one of the Jewish people threw a rock and hit him in the head and knocked him out. He was incapacitated for a while because he was a traitor. But this Jewish war with the Romans resulted basically in the massacre. The Romans obviously won, and the temple in Jerusalem was razed to the ground, just like when the Babylonians did. And the Zealots were massacred, clearly. You know the story of Masada and how many of them hid out there and were massacred there, and many committed suicide. But the Essene community and the Sadducees, you know about the Sadducees from the New Testament, all these communities of the Jews basically got wiped out after AD 70. The only group that really survived were the Pharisees, and they're basically the prelude to Rabbinic Judaism, which is what continued on in the 2nd and 3rd century and on. And good evidence, by the way, that the Essenes did not survive the Jewish war is the fact that none of them went back to get their precious scrolls. I mean, you can imagine if any of the Essenes had survived, you'd think they would have went back to their caves. I mean, maybe some of them couldn't. Maybe they got arrested and were in prison. They didn't get slaughtered. But still, the point is, the Essenes had to have been, we know that they're pretty much wiped out because they didn't go back to get their scrolls. Those scrolls and everything that was in those caves, and presumably this treasure from the treasure map, from the copper scroll, they remained there for 2,000 years until that goat came in there. That goat wandered into Cave 1. So the life and death of the Essenes, like I said, I didn't get into all the details on this, but scholars basically place the beginning of the Essenes around 150 BC during this significant time in ancient Judaism called the Hasmonean dynasty. That's probably when the Essenes arose and broke off and started their communities. And one of them probably started near the Dead Sea. So 150 BC to 70 AD when they were wiped out by the Romans. 75 AD to be more exact. Pretty much the same life as the Sadducees. The Sadducees had that same kind of lifespan as well. And the Zealots had even less. The Zealots probably began around the time of Jesus' birth, and then they were wiped out in AD 70. Some of them might have survived and fought at the Bar Kokhba revolt, which happened in 132 to 135 AD. But that was the last straw for Jews fighting against Rome. And this is very interesting when you think about how the Essenes got wiped out like this, and you compare them with the early Christians, because there are so many parallels to the early Christians and the Essenes. The Essenes got completely annihilated by the Roman Empire, completely dead after AD 70 pretty much. And the other community, this group of Nazarenes, this group of Christians, they went on to conquer the Roman Empire and really conquer the world, the largest religion in the world today. All with sacrificial love, with martyrdoms, and the preaching of a crucified man as Lord of the world. Really incredible. And I think first time I thought of it as I was putting this together, Gamaliel's wisdom really comes into play, more fitting with the Essenes than ever. Because remember, Gamaliel's wisdom in Acts chapter 5 was, if these Christians, or if any group, or if any movement dies off, if any movement is of man, it will die off. It will go away. But if this movement is of God, you cannot stop this movement. You will find yourselves fighting against God. And if you look at history, I think we see exactly those two play out with the Essenes on the former and the Christians on the latter. So let me get back to trying to fulfill my promise on blowing your minds when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls and what it did for biblical studies. At least it blows my mind every time I think about it. It's really incredible. But first, you have to know the state of manuscripts and versions of the Old Testament that we had previous to 1947. The most ancient Hebrew manuscript in existence before 1947 was what's called the Nash Papyrus, which only had the Ten Commandments and part of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's all we had as far as Hebrew manuscripts going back to, and that went back to 125 BC. After that, the earliest we had of the Hebrew Old Testament started in the Middle Ages. So we're looking at 9th century AD, 10th century, 11th century. By the time we get to the 11th century AD, now we have all the books of the Old Testament in Hebrew in medieval Middle Ages manuscripts. In fact, a manuscript from the 11th century, which we know as referred to often as the Masoretic text. This is the base. This is the Hebrew manuscripts that all of our English translations, pretty much all, even Jewish, Christian, all Bibles today are based on that those manuscripts that date to about 11th century AD. So that means that overnight, that goat from the spring of 1947 took us from the 11th century AD in Hebrew manuscripts to 250 BC in Hebrew manuscripts and 230 Hebrew manuscript, all books of the Bible except for Esther. 1,200 years span. Truly incredible. Now, let me also tell you, we did have, and we do have, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of very ancient Hebrew manuscripts that we no longer have. But that the Dead Sea Scrolls date to the same time, by the way. But we have these Greek manuscripts that we call the Septuagint. But even those date to, the actual manuscripts date to the 4th century AD, even though that was probably written around 250 BC. But the manuscripts actually date to about the 4th century AD. So again, the Dead Sea Scrolls take us back almost 600 years before the Septuagint manuscripts. So the next most important question here is, well, how similar are these Hebrew Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts to the ones that all of our English Bibles are based on, that are translated from? The Masoretic text. There's almost like we said, 1,000 to 1,200 year span between them. How similar are they? Let me just use the Isaiah scroll as an example here. As I said, the earliest we had before 1947 was the Masoretic text, dating around 1,000 to 1,100. All of our modern translations are based on this text right here. Discovery in 1947, Dead Sea Scrolls takes us back, not just with Isaiah, but just about all the books, to around 100 to 150 BC. And when, like for example with Isaiah, when you compare Isaiah to the Masoretic text, you find that it's pretty much 99% the same text. So there are variants, there are different spelling, there are grammatical issues, there are different things. There are definitely differences. It's not identical. But by all even more liberal scholars' standpoint, it's pretty accurate. It's an incredible thing that for almost 1,200 years we see that these Jewish scribes accurately transmitted Isaiah to the Masoretic text, which is, again, all of our English translations are based on that. Truly incredible thing. And like I said, that's not just Isaiah. That is just about all, especially the Pentateuch. I mean, the Pentateuch, they found the books of Moses. The transcription of the books of Moses is the most accurate of them all, even when it comes to even the variants. So truly a mind-blowing and incredible thing of what the Dead Sea Scrolls did for us when it comes to biblical Hebrew manuscripts and showing the accurate transmission of them. Let me say a few words about the canon in Qumran. So it also shed new light on the canon. What books of the Old Testament are inspired? Which books did the Jews believe were from God? And we have, I have here the three examples where you have this threefold division of the Old Testament. This is one of the apocryphal books, Jesus ben Sirach, and this is the prologue, which dates to 132 BC. And notice he discusses the threefold division, the law, the prophets, and the other books of our ancestors. Jesus said something very similar when he said that everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. And then we find in one of the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts, the book of Moses and the books of the prophets and in David, something very similar to Jesus. So the Qumran community, similar to the early Christians, similar to Josephus, similar to a lot of the people that we have writings from that discuss the canonical books, they had this threefold division. Clearly the books of Moses, clearly the prophets, and then the writings or the Ketuvim, the other books that make up what they considered the canonical books. Josephus, by the way, is the most specific here and gives us the 22, which are the same as our 39 Old Testament books as the Jewish canonical books. And that's really been consistent throughout history with the Hebrew canon. the Dead Sea Scroll, the Essene community, it's possible that they accepted books beyond the canonical books. But what we do know for sure is they accepted the canonical books, except for Esther. Esther, we don't know for sure. But bare minimum, they accepted the 23 books because they pretty much quote or say as it is written and speak of them in authoritative ways. The bare minimum, the canonical books, the 23 of the 24 canonical books. It's possible that they accepted other books like First Enoch, maybe some of those unknown Psalms. They might have had more books that they thought were from God than others. We just don't know about those books because they never quote them as authoritative like they do with the canonical books. So the best thing that we have from them is just that they for sure accepted the very common Jewish canon that was pretty prevalent in the day that is very specific from Josephus. Let me tell you some interesting readings as I head towards the end. I got about 15 minutes left, but there are some very fascinating things that the Dead Sea Scrolls also did when it comes to the variants, because just like in the New Testament, we have a lot of passages, a lot of manuscripts where we have two different readings and scholars have to make a decision which is the actual original reading of this text. What did Matthew or John or Paul originally write here? Same thing in the Old Testament. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think, have answered a lot of those questions definitively for us. So when it comes to, say, Deuteronomy 32:8, let me just bring that text up and show you. So, and basically all our English translations, we have, this is pretty much all the modern English translation Bibles, this is what you find. When the Most High, when God gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. And it's the sons of Israel here that's the interesting text, because in the Hebrew there, in the Masoretic text, the one that dates, remember, to the 11th century AD, it has B'nai Israel, which is the sons of Israel. Now, the Septuagint, the Greek there, what does it have? In Deuteronomy 32:8, the Greek has angels of God, according to the number of not the sons of Israel, but the angels of God. Now, up until the Dead Sea Scroll discovery, we had no ancient manuscripts. We know the Septuagint translators were working off of Hebrew manuscripts that dated to sometime before the 250 BC. They were working on manuscripts that ancient, but we don't have those. The Dead Sea Scrolls get discovered. Now we have manuscripts that date to just about that same time. And what does Deuteronomy 32:8 say in the Dead Sea Scrolls? It says, B'nai Elohim, which is in English, the sons of God, which now we see that the Septuagint translators were correct in what they were translating, because if their Hebrew manuscript said B'nai Elohim, sons of God, angels of God is a pretty accurate translation of that, because sons of God in the Old Testament generally means, just about in every instance, except I think in one passage in Hosea, it means angels. It means the angelic realm. So the original reading here in Deuteronomy 32:8 is according to the number of the sons of God, which would be the angels of God it's referring to here, not the sons of Israel. The sons of Israel didn't even exist at the time when this is referring back to what happened in Genesis 10. So an interesting confirmation of the Septuagint that the Dead Sea Scrolls did for us here. Another really interesting one, especially for early Christianity, is Psalm 22:16. So this is a very common psalm applied to Jesus on the cross, because it begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What Jesus said from the cross, and it's also quoted many times in the New Testament. But this particular passage, they pierced my hands and my feet, is not directly quoted in the New Testament. And the English translators here do the opposite of what they did with Deuteronomy 32a. So in Deuteronomy 32a, they sided with the Masoretic text, sons of Israel, and went against the Septuagint, which was angels of God. Here, Psalm 22:16, they do the opposite. Here they side with the Septuagint, because it's the Septuagint here that says, they pierced my hands and feet. The Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, says, like a lion, my hands and feet. The Hebrew word just needs to be pointed differently. It's very similar, Hebrew word there. Or they pierced, or like a lion, okay? So, which is the correct reading? Did the English translators in modern Bibles get it right by saying they pierced my hands and feet, siding with the Septuagint against the Hebrew in the Masoretic text? Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls were then discovered in 1947. Psalm 22:16 is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What does it say? Drum roll, please. It says they pierced my hands and my feet. So the Dead Sea Scrolls confirms the Septuagint translation, and also confirms the early Christians who used this text pretty regularly to say that this was a prophecy of Jesus' crucifixion. A very interesting passage speaking about the piercing of hands and feet, especially if David wrote this back in the 10th century BC, when crucifixion did not even exist. So another interesting reading. There's tons of these, but I'm just going to give you a few. Another one is what's known as the resurrection fragment. So this is a piece, not very big, only about 10 lines, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what's so interesting about this one is it parallels incredibly something Jesus says in response to John the Baptist in Matthew 11 and in Luke 7. It's a Q saying of Jesus, something that's in Matthew and Luke. It's not in Mark. And by the way, this is something that scholars, even more liberal scholars, agree Jesus said. This is one of those sayings that just about everybody agrees the historical Jesus said this. And this is what the resurrection fragment from, it's just called the resurrection fragment, but it's 4Q 521. For the first number always means what cave it was in. So this is cave 4. The Q means Qumran. And then this is the 521st manuscript to come out of that particular cave. So if you ever see these numbers, that's your little how-to on that. But it says, for he will honor the pious upon the throne of an eternal kingdom, freeing prisoners, giving sight to the blind, straightening out the twisted. It's talking about God, obviously. And forever shall I cling to those who hope, and in his mercy, and the fruit of, you're missing things, remember, because it's fragmentary, not be delayed. And the Lord will perform marvelous acts such as have not existed, just as he said, for he will heal the badly wounded and will make the dead live. This is why it's called the resurrection. He will proclaim good news to the poor, and he will lead the captives free and enrich the hungry. Now, this is very interesting because look what Jesus says when he responds to John the Baptist's question, are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else? Jesus said, go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who does not take offense at me. What's so incredible about these two passages is that they both completely independent of each other. I mean, it's very highly doubtful Matthew and Luke independently, who both had the same, somehow had some parallel with the Essene community. But they independently are alluding, if you look at the text, they're alluding to Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61. They're basically quoting a verse from Isaiah 35 and a verse from Isaiah 61. And they are both adding to the text this statement about the rising of the dead. The rising of the dead is not in Isaiah 35 and it's not in Isaiah 61. So both of them independently bring up this idea that the dead will be raised, and this is evidence that the kingdom of God has come. But of course, in the Qumran fragment, it's God who raises the dead and ushers in the kingdom. In the New Testament, it's Jesus who raises the dead. John, I'm raising the dead. That means the kingdom has come. So very, very interesting fragment and interesting parallel with this amazing saying of Jesus. The last thing I wanted to do is, in light of all that we said, I just wanted to read this story from the New Testament about Jesus, the beginning of his ministry. In Matthew and in Luke, again, independently, Matthew and Luke most likely were not using one another. They were writing independent of one another, and they independently, after Jesus' baptism, after his temptation account, say that he went to Nazareth. He went to Nazareth first, and then he went to Capernaum. But what's interesting is only Luke gives us the detailed account of what happened at Nazareth, and it's what he did in the synagogue in Nazareth. And let me just read this account, just a short few verses here. So, and he, Jesus, came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And good old NASB has the little note here, and they should have just put this in the text, because it's not a book, it's a scroll. This is the scroll of Isaiah. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and he opened or unrolled the scroll. This isn't like a book, he would have unrolled it. And he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And he closed the book and gave it back, or unrolled the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Now, of course, what's really interesting about this, in light of the greatest discovery of Qumran, the complete scroll of Isaiah, this scroll that was handed to Jesus that he unrolled, the scroll that we have from Qumran dates 200 years before this scroll. Now, this scroll might go back that long too. We don't know how ancient this scroll is in the synagogue. But it's pretty incredible that the scroll that Jesus is holding here, we have the same scroll of Isaiah in Hebrew that you unroll. We have that same scroll, we have 200 years before this event, before when this happened. An incredible thing. And we can also be pretty sure that this scroll that Jesus read, just like the one from the Qumran community, would have been in Hebrew. And what it looked like when he looked down to find Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2, which is what these two verses represent, when he looked to find that, it would have looked probably just like the scroll from the Qumran community. Maybe there were a few variants, maybe there were some variants and differences, but as far as the way it would have looked the same. And so I want to show you what it looked like. You can actually go online, Google the digital Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can look at them online. You don't even have to travel to Jerusalem and to Amman, Jordan, but you should anyway. You need to just be right near them and see them. But I can click on, this is the actual Isaiah scroll, and they look at what they've done. They've made it to where I can click on and they translate the verses for me. But if I go over to where Isaiah 61 is, it's right here. Stop moving. So here's Isaiah 61. Look, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed. And then here's that verse, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now what's really neat is we can zoom in. Remember this scroll? This is 125, 150 BC. We can zoom in. Look how close we can get. This is something you couldn't even do behind the pane glass. So I know you can't read Hebrew, but I just want you to look at what Jesus would have looked at, because this is what he would have looked at. This right here is to proclaim. This is year. This is favorable or well-pleasing. So to proclaim the year, the favorable year. This is the holy name of God. So this isn't Lord, this is Yahweh. This is the tetragrammaton right here. Then to proclaim the year, the favorable year of the Lord. And notice these three words right here. These three words, notice Jesus would have seen them. They're right here, right after what he just said. But Jesus he rolled the scroll back. Remember, he stopped and he gave it to his attendant. And what did he say? He said, this that you have heard in your hearing, this scripture has been fulfilled. That's what he said. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is what has been fulfilled. But this says, Yom Nakam Eloheinu, which is the day of vengeance of our God. So, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. But Jesus didn't read that, did he? He didn't read that because that had not been fulfilled yet. So the first part, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, that's what Jesus read. And that's what had been fulfilled in his ministry, and it's still being fulfilled. Today is the day of salvation. Now is the time of the Lord's favor. But one day, and the day of vengeance of our God will come. And that scripture will then be fulfilled. An incredible thing that we can look at the exact text that Jesus looked at, the way he saw it. I think the greatest thing about these scrolls and reading them is that Jesus Christ is found within them, because he's found within the law, the prophets, and the Psalms and the writings. He's found within the Hebrew, Hebraicus Veritas, the truth in the Hebrew. Jesus is the truth in the Hebrew. And he is that me, when you just think about this text, he is the me. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me. He has sent me. He is the me in Isaiah 61:1. And of course, he is the one that the hands and feet were pierced in Psalm 22, and on and on. And I'll just read one more text in John 5:39. I thought was appropriate. Jesus said, you search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. It is these that testify about me, and you are unwilling to come to me so that you may have life. And then he says, for if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. And so did David, and so did Isaiah, and so did Micah, and so did Daniel, and all the prophets, which God has graciously preserved for us after thousands and thousands of years by sending that goat. Remember, he's the hero of the story. Don't forget the goat. So study and read and treasure these treasures from Qumran, but know that they all point to him, within whom is all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Thank you very much. That's what I had to share. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Do you want to maybe unshare your screen? Just hit the unshare button at the top.
Okay.
See it?
Oh, stop sharing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was a very fascinating presentation, and I learned a bunch of stuff, so very grateful. Folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If you would like to talk to Dr. Bess, then click the raise hand button at the top of your screen. I'll be happy to promote you to panelist. Or if you'd like to submit a question in textual form, just click the Q&A button at the top of your screen, type in a question, click enter. We have a few questions submitted. I wanted to ask you the first about your view on 7Q5, which I know O'Callaghan has argued is a fragment from the Gospel of Mark. What's your view on that?
Yeah, from what I've read on 7Q5 is that there was a Roman Catholic priest that tried to argue that this was a fragment of the Gospel of Mark, which of course would be incredible. This would be probably almost as good as the full Isaiah scroll to have any of the Gospels predating 70 and have those manuscripts. But unfortunately, the fragment is so small that I think it only has kai, which is the Greek word for and. And so I don't think that from and you could get the Gospel of Mark or any text, this is one of the most common, words used in the New Testament. So,
Okay, I thought
most scholars reject that.
Yeah, I'm aware most scholars reject it. I thought from memory that it has Kneseret on it.
From what I have to check again, but from what I've read, it was the only thing that could truly be made out was Chi. Is what I was told.
Okay. That's fair enough.
Because I did look at that. There were so many things I couldn't include in this lecture because I only had a short time.
Yeah. Also, there was a recent news report of a new cave on the Dead Sea is being discovered, but I think further research discovered that it had been looted, and unfortunately anything that was there is there no longer. Right. You heard about that, right? Yeah, there's a new Dead Sea Scrolls cave discovered, which could have been very exciting news, but was a bit of an anticlimax.
And I think we will find more. I think more will be discovered. They did find in 2007, they found what they call the Dead Sea Stone, with it's like the vision of Gabriel, is the way they refer to it. It has some interesting passages about something about coming to life after 3 days. So some interesting things there. But
yeah. Ray asks, I hear, actually, this is a little bit off topic, but he's asking about authorship of the Gospels. And he's saying, people who hear the authorship of the Gospels, what's the situation with other historical writings? For example, My Complete Works of Tacitus doesn't have Tacitus signing his books either at the beginning or the end. How do we know Tacitus wrote Tacitus?
Okay, what was the question though?
He was asking how we know Tacitus wrote Tacitus.
Oh, how we know Tacitus wrote Tacitus?
Yeah.
I have to go back.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
On the quick on Tacitus right now. I mean, I know there's no debate. There's no debate on Tacitus, right?
Yeah.
Tacitus.
On the general question though of gospel authorship, because he's asking about the anonymity of the gospel. Yeah, it's certainly true that there are many other ancient works which are technically anonymous. Right? Clement of Rome, for example, never mentions I hereby, as Clement of Rome, declare. Nonetheless, we know that Clement of Rome wrote the epistle to the Corinthian church. At least there's good reason to think that he did, because Irenaeus tells us that Clement of Rome wrote a certain letter to the church in Corinth, and he describes some of the contents, and it resembles very closely that of First Clement. Likewise, there's other ones like that as well. But as we were discussing earlier, before the show started, there's good evidence for the gospel authorship tradition. Some of the external evidence concerns the unanimity and uniformity and geographical widespreadness of the authorship tradition, etc. Right. I mean, I have a whole lecture on authorship of the Gospels, but it's a bit off topic for tonight. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I believe that the authors of the Gospels, according to church tradition, are accurate.
Yeah.
I would do some things with Matthew, but I do think that Matthew's ultimately behind it. But.
Yeah. I mean, there's strong external evidence, and there's even stronger internal evidence, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's both.
Yeah. Arkan asks, was John the Baptist an Essene? Is that why Jesus sent him that specific statement about the healings and the raising of the dead as evidence of him being the Messiah?
No, that's an excellent question. Yeah, and some scholars have argued this. So what's very interesting is John the Baptist was celibate. John the Baptist baptized. And John the Baptist was right there in the Jordan River in the Judean wilderness. He would have been very near. I mean, we're talking walking distance. He would have been pretty close to the Essene community. Did he know any of the Essene community? I mean, it's hard to believe that he didn't. Do I think he was an Essene? I don't think so. I think John the Baptist, all our evidence of John the Baptist is that he's doing something different than the Essenes, because he's pointing to this one particular man, the man Jesus, as the Messiah. Now, the Essenes were looking for the Messiah, but they were looking for multiple Messiahs, a Messiah of Aaron, a more priestly Messiah, and a Messiah of David, so a kingly Messiah. And they didn't think that these Messiahs would be God or anything like that. They just believed that they would be men that were supernaturally empowered by God to accomplish his purposes. So I do think that John the Baptist probably had some connection in some way, but I don't think he himself was an Essene at all. just because if we believe what the Gospels tell us about him, he went a completely different way than the Essenes. So with Jesus.
An anonymous attendee asks, can you give us any further information on the Dead Sea Scrolls spelling of Psalm 22:16, please?
Spelling?
Yeah.
Well, it's the word that we translate as pierced. Basically, it literally means to dig in, to dug, but it's a way of referring to I can't remember off the top of my head other parallels, but
Yeah.
piercing. Piercing is the Greek word that they use. They use the real strong word that means pierce, literally pierce, in the Greek Septuagint. So they probably had the exact same word that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and their what they call Vorlog, the Hebrew manuscripts that they had that we don't have anymore, but the ones that they had in 250 BC, that if the story is correct, they took from Jerusalem. That word there is the same word that was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a word that fully appropriate to translate it, pierced.
What is that Hebrew word, Justin?
Yes.
Okay.
It's like, sorry, it's Dead Sea Scrolls, so we'll have to get the. You can go to the next question you want to.
Okay, sure.
I need to get the.
Sure. Arkan asks, how did the Essene read Isaiah 53? What's their commentary? Is it a prophecy of a coming Messiah?
That's a great question. Hold on just a second. Psalms. See, because it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I can't just look it up right away. I have to find the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't have it there either. Yeah, I'll have to get back to you on that.
No problem. All right. So on Isaiah 53.
It'd take me a while to find that exact manuscript from the Psalms I have it on Logos, the Hebrew of the biblical manuscript. Sure. But yeah, on Isaiah 53, there is a fascinating thing in Isaiah 53 when it comes to those variants. We don't have any commentary on Isaiah 53 from the Qumran community. So we don't have anything that speaks specifically about the Messiah. But what we do have that's very interesting is in 53, I think it's verse 11, it talks about how he will, after it talks about him being crushed by the Lord and things, it says he will see light. And this is what it says in the Septuagint. It says he will see light. So in the Greek translation, again, it says he will, after the suffering of his soul, he will see light. That's what it is. And in the Masoretic text, it says, it changes it a little bit, and it says he will just see. It doesn't say light. It drops light. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, come in for the rescue, and the Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah 53, the Hebrew has, he will see light. So it's a small thing, but a big thing, because that's such a rich passage that the early Christian Jews, and we know that other Jews believed was Messianic. So we know from the Targums of Isaiah, they were reading Isaiah 53, not as a suffering Messiah, but as a Messiah who would cause the Gentiles to suffer. So they switch it around, but they still see it referring to the Messiah.
Right. Andrew Murphy asks, please can you tell us the names of the books about the scrolls again?
Oh, yes. It's the Complete Dead Sea Scrolls, translated by Geza Vermesh, Geza Vermes, and that's the Penguin Classic. And then the other one is the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, and it's translated and with commentary by Martin Abegg, Abegg, and then Peter Flint, Flint, and then Eugene Ulrich, Ulrich. And the other one was Garcia Martinez, the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Bible, but that's the one that's Hebrew that has the Hebrew on one side and the English on the other.
King's Servant asks, is there anything more you can tell us about Essene baptism?
Let's see, with baptism. I've been there to the Qumran community, and they actually have, you can still go walk into the area where they would baptize. But they seem to be baptizing like John the Baptist baptized, by immersion. They would go under the water. I can't remember off the top of my head if someone administered the baptism or if they did it themselves, because there is some evidence that some might have done it themselves. But yeah, they were unique in that other than the early Christians, none of the Jews baptized like this. So this idea of baptism, the Essenes did it, and John the Baptist and the early Christians started doing it. And of course, the early Christians continued on. The Essenes got wiped out, so baptism continued with the Christians. But they did see it. They saw it as a cleansing. So they saw it as a way of repentance and forgiving of sins. So very similar. Their idea of baptism was a very similar concept.
Ron Woodruff asks, so is the remainder of the Isaiah quote not in Jesus' quote because it had not yet been fulfilled? Yeah, that's right. I think he's talking about Isaiah 61.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's possible. Yeah, because of I think that text probably is more dealing with that's why resurrection fragment is probably not the best title for it, because I think it's more dealing just with the fact that Jesus is raising the dead, that this is a miracle that's happening, not resurrection, but people are just coming back to life, because it also references the eyes of the blind being opened, people being healed, physical healing. So these were things that it seems that not just we see in the New Testament, but also from the Essene community and others that believe that when the kingdom of God came, these kinds of things should be happening. Healings, the blind seeing, the deaf hearing, the dead being raised. That's what's amazing, is that they both reference the dead being raised, even though that's not in Isaiah.
I wanted to ask you also, you mentioned that the Dead Sea Scrolls turn out the entire Isaiah scroll, right? You've got the entirety of Isaiah preserved for us in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And there may be a few parts that are damaged.
Right.
I mean, it's like 98% there.
What would you say to the argument that you're cherry picking here? Because if you look at, say, Jeremiah, it's about a third shorter.
Yeah, and that's true. So when it comes to the books, when we look at, like I showed in that chart, take the books from the Dead Sea Scrolls and look at how they got copied and copied and copied all the way to the Masoretic text. How close are they? Like I said, vast majority of the books, just about all of them, are intact like Isaiah. First Samuel, the books of Samuel, really, which is just one book. The Jews, Samuel is Samuel. First and Second Samuel is just Samuel. And then Jeremiah, we see different rearrangement of chapters. The Isaiah in the Hebrew Masoretic text is 13% larger. The Jeremiah, did I say Jeremiah? The Jeremiah in the Hebrew Masoretic text is 13% larger than the Jeremiah of the Septuagint. And we see with the Dead Sea Scroll, Jeremiah, it's probably more in line with the Hebrew manuscript that was behind the Septuagint translation as well. So what we have with Jeremiah is similar to the New Testament manuscripts. They grew not 13%, but the New Testament manuscripts, I think Dan Wallace, my professor, he always says it's around 2 or 3 or 4%. I think they grew over from 2nd century to like the 14th century. The manuscripts and the over time the text of the New Testament grew by about, I can't remember exactly, but somewhere around 3 or 4%. That seems to be what happened with Jeremiah. It just grew a lot more. But I've looked at every single one of the differences, and we're talking about just extra text. We're just talking about the same thing, like the same kind of prophecy, the same kind of something that's said somewhere else in the book, just repeated again. And that's why it's bigger. So it's not like there's all this new material or all this significant theological material in Jeremiah that's deleted, and we have different texts. We just clearly have this growth of material. For whatever reason, the scribes added more to Jeremiah, but we don't have that with the other books. The other books have been preserved pretty intact.
Yeah. And that's kind of answered the question of David Gadboys, who also asked, what challenging variations do we find in the biblical scrolls? How do you deal with these?
Yeah, Jeremiah is the most, I think, Samuel, same with Samuel. What we find in Samuel is we just have, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, preserved a few readings that we didn't have in the Masoretic text. That was in the Septuagint, but not in the Masoretic text. The Dead Sea Scrolls, now we have it in Hebrew. There's some passages like that. But Jeremiah is the only one that seems to almost be like a different textual tradition. I know you're familiar with like the Book of Acts. The Book of Acts in certain manuscripts has is larger and smaller different manuscripts. And some scholars theorize that maybe Luke had two different versions that went out. Maybe Jeremiah had two different versions. It's possible. I think what most likely happened is it just like the Targums, we see like kind of a precedence of the Targums. You know, hundreds of years later, the text started to be used for maybe specific purposes, and paraphrases start to be added in and different things. But even with Jeremiah, even though we have those Jeremiah those examples of Jeremiah that are very different than the Masoretic text, we also have manuscripts of Jeremiah that show that they're in line with the Masoretic text. So I lean towards more maybe the rearrangement and the large additions and the large changes, better say, is more like a Targum type paraphrase that's being used like a modern version, almost like the Message, like it's like the Message version of Jeremiah or something like that. Mm-hmm. But Jeremiah is one to wrestle with and to find exactly what's going on. But like I said, when it comes to the heart of the book of Jeremiah, it's there. It's just we have a lot of excess. So that's why it's similar to the New Testament. We have the New Testament within all the 5,000, 6,000 Greek manuscripts, but there is some excess. There's some excess that the scribes have added.
Arkan asks, so do you think that the Masoretic transmission purposefully changed the Psalm 22 they have pierced and Isaiah 53 light?
Yeah, I think now that we're getting more and more evidence, I do think the Masoretes, I think the Jewish Masoretes, who no doubt were heavily feeling the Christian dominance in the world, I think that they were they messed with some of those texts that were specifically being used in a Messianic way. And it's not just those. There's another one in Daniel 9 that seems to be the way that the Masoretes, the way it's written in the Masoretic text is written in a way where it kind of makes sure that the Messiah figure in Daniel 9 could not be anyone beyond the Maccabean era. So I do see with Isaiah 53, with Psalm 22, and there's probably others that I just didn't remember when I was
Another example, possibly Psalm 110, where in verse 1 it says, Yahweh says to Adoni, Adoni, of course, being the possessive form of Adon, meaning my master or my Lord, to be distinguished from Adonai, which only ever denotes Yahweh. Except what's interesting about Psalm 110 is that in verse 5, the one seated at Yahweh's right hand is Adonai. It says, Adonai is at your right hand, right? Even in the Masoretic, with the Masoretic vowel pointing, it's Adonai rather than Adoni, which suggests that, well, maybe verse 1 originally was Adonai, but because of the Christian utilization of this text, it was changed to Adoni.
Right. Yeah, that could be another example. I need to go back and see if Psalm 110, I can't remember if that's represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That'd be a good one to check and see if it's Adonai.
Well, before the Masoretics, of course, there was no distinction between Adonai and Adoni. So I think, from memory, Psalm 110 is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but you cannot distinguish between Adoni and Adonai prior to the Masoretics in terms of the way it's written. Although the Masoretics kind of captured.
You're saying because of the pointing.
Yeah, exactly. they kind
Okay,
of
yes.
captured what was already part of their traditions and stuff. But
Yeah, you're right. And I'm pretty sure Psalm 110 is represented.
yeah. You can argue on other grounds independent of that distinction for the deity of the individual in Psalm 110 in any case.
No, I think, like you said, the fact that Adonai is used later and it's clearly the same individual.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I mean, Anthony Buzzard, I had him on my webinar, and he tried to argue that, because I made that point, and he tried to argue that it's actually just a reversal of verse 1, because just as in Psalm 109, Yahweh's at the right hand of the needy one, in Psalm 16, Yahweh's at the right hand of the psalmist. And so he argues that just as David's Lord is at the right hand of Yahweh in verse 1, so Yahweh's at the right hand of David's Lord in verse 5. My response to that is to show that if you keep reading and you get as far as, say, verse 7, I mean, all the reference of the he's are back to verse 5. And so Adonai in verse 7 is identified as one who drinks from a brook, which is a human prerogative. So this individual in Psalm 110 is both human and divine. So the Adonai verse 5 must be understood to be also human. So you've got this divine human figure in Psalm 110. And also Jesus makes the argument in Mark 12 that it's not referring to David's natural son or one of his normal descendants, because none of them should be greater than David. And Hebrews 1 makes the argument that it can't be referring to any angelic being, because none of them, because they're just ministering spirits sent to serve for the sake of those who inherit salvation. And Psalm 89 makes it clear that it can't be talking about any ruler of the earth, because they are all made subject to David, right? It says, I'll make David my firstborn among the kings of the earth in Psalm 89. So who then is left? Well, God, right? So anonymous attendee asks, Robert Gagnon has made the point that there are some scrolls that argue against polygamy based on the same text Jesus used in Matthew 19, citing Genesis 1:27 and some other text. Are you familiar with this and know which scroll it comes from?
Yeah, I can get that. I can actually get that real quick for you, because I just looked at that. Pretty sure that's from the yeah, that's from the Damascus document. Yeah, he in the Damascus document, he argues from Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 7:9 when they went in 2 by 2, talking about the animals, and then also Deuteronomy 17:17 that they should not multiply wives among themselves. And all three of those texts they're arguing for monogamy and against polygamy. That's a Damascus document, which is usually in the acronym CD in all caps, and it's column 4, line 21 through column 5, lines 1 through 6.
David Gadboys asks, are there more Dead Sea Scroll materials still awaiting publication?
No, this is why it's ideal to do the talk now. Really, ever since 2002, I think, was the end. So what publications that I did not bring up, because this is like the ultimate. If you're like actually, gonna write a serious book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, would you consult this? But there are 39 volumes. They're called the DJD series, and it's the Discovery of the Judean Desert. That's what the DJD stands for. And 39 volumes. And this is all the Dead Sea Scrolls, including even the smallest fragment, published with facsimiles, with pictures, photographs, and all 39 volumes were completed in 2002. They began in 1948. So it took like almost 60 years to complete it. But Emmanuel Tove, another great scholar, he's the reason why it got done. A Jewish scholar that was put in charge of the project, and about half of those got finished in the last, not in the last, but from like 1991 to 2002, almost half of those 39 volumes were done. So they started to get worked on a rapid pace. So yeah, so until there's new discoveries, all the Dead Sea Scrolls are done in those series, and all the relevant ones are in these two books, because both these books, by the way, were published in the 90s. So.
Life asks, so there's a common claim that there's only 3 major variants between the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Aleppo Codex. Do I understand this to be false?
3 variants? Yeah, that's false.
Yeah.
It depends on what you mean by variant. I mean, if they mean like, not even 3, I mean, there's a lot of spelling differences, there's a lot of grammatical differences, there's a lot of there are different words, word order, things like that. But we're talking, like I said, 98, 99% the same.
Mm-hmm.
So like whatever differences there are, they make up about 1%.
Wayne Ferguson asks, how familiar are you with the Nag Hammadi material, and how relevant is it to biblical studies compared to the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, I mean, Nag Hammadi is more relevant to I don't think it's a significant discovery. It was a significant discovery for sure. This would be in the top discoveries that have happened. It's not that exciting because there's a bunch of heretics, but anyways, but really it's more impactful to Gnosticism and 2nd century Christianity and their opponents, because basically before the Nag Hammadi discovery, we only had quotations from the early church fathers on what the Gnostics and certain groups believed. And then when the Nag Hammadi library was discovered, now we have the actual writings from who were pretty much the heretics. So now we have the heretics, right? We have them in their own words, which is very helpful, and how they viewed things. And so they're very important for sure. I don't think they've had as significant an impact on biblical studies and everything as the Dead Sea Scrolls have had, but they've had a big impact. They're a significant discovery for sure.
Okay, well, that was the last. Oh, this has just been another one. As someone asks, Wayne Ferguson asks, are there any Gnostic texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No.
The answer, I think, is no. Yeah. All right. Well, that was. Someone Will asks, how is dating the scrolls established?
The dating?
Yeah.
Yeah, for one, we have a nice cap of 70 because of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70. We know that happened, and so that helps with kind of putting a cap on the dating of them. But also the best radiocarbon scholars and people who are experts in radiocarbon dating did that on all the manuscripts, and all the manuscripts basically fall right within that window of like 150 BC and 50 AD. So the dating of the manuscripts is like in no way debated. There's some weird views from some scholars on some of the interpretations of the Essene community and the teacher of righteousness and things like that, but dating isn't something they debate.
I think handwriting is also a factor.
Yeah, handwriting's a big thing. Yeah. And something really interesting on the handwriting is the fact that the more ancient of the biblical scrolls, so like in the Pentateuch and in Job, only Job outside the Pentateuch has this very ancient Paleo Hebrew. There's writing in the ancient Paleo Hebrew, which is one of the most ancient. It's basically the most ancient stage of Hebrew, and it's in the books of Moses and in Job. So it's kind of an interesting thing that we find.
Yeah. So that was all the questions that were submitted. Does anyone want to ask any final questions before we wrap up for today? Okay, thanks so much, Justin, for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. It's been very insightful and edifying.
This was fun. Thanks so much for having me, John.
Indeed, we must have you back sometime in the future again.
Yes, sir.
Indeed. So
I'll have good internet by then, God willing.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on again, and I'll see everyone else next week. All right. Good evening.